Hi my dear students, welcome back to another video lesson on your plus 2 English course. Dear children, we have already completed the first block of your course book. Now we are proceeding to the second block, the heights of harmony. Harmony means peaceful coexistence. And as the title suggests, this block focuses on the need for harmonious living. It focuses on the need for friendly, cordial relationships in the society. And the first lesson we have in this block is a poem, Mending by Robert Frost. But before we read this poem, I would like to tell you about two of his other poems, two great poems by the same poet. One, Road Not Taken, a very famous poem. Now you could read the concluding lines of that great poem, Road Not Taken. So please read the concluding lines of that poem. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. See, what do you mean by these lines? What do you understand from these lines? Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So the speaker here is a traveler. And as he walks along, he comes to a place wherein the road diverges into two. And he's in a dilemma whether to take the first road or the second. And finally, which road he takes? He decides to take the road less traveled by. That means the road which is not used by too many people, the untrodden road, he decides to go by. And he says that has made all the difference in his life. So on the face of it, it's a very simple poem and it conveys a very simple idea. But is it that simple? Don't you think it conveys something beyond the literal meaning of those lines? And what do these lines convey actually? Suppose this road is a symbol of life. It symbolizes the journey of life. Then what would the whole poem convey? Then it would convey that in our journey of life, we come across situations wherein we have to make tough choices. And instead of following what the others do, instead of blindly imitating others, we should make tough choices in life and be ready to take up challenges. So in that way, these lines are highly inspiring, and this poem inspires us to take up challenges in life. This is one reading, this is one interpretation of the poem. You could interpret the poem in your own way. You please read this poem and enjoy it on your own. Now let us move on to the second poem here. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Another great poem by the same poet. And go through the last four lines of this poem, the concluding lines of this poem. In a way, the whole poem is summed up in these lines. These lines sum up the whole idea conveyed in the poem. Woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. And I have miles to go before I sleep, and I have miles to go before I sleep. So dear children, these are the concluding lines of that great poem. And these lines inspired our former Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And he had these lines written on his office table. What do you find these lines so inspiring? What do you think was the reason why Nehru found it so inspiring? What do these lines actually convey? On the face of it, it's something so simple. It's a simple idea. A traveler is the speaker here. A traveler on horseback stops his horse and then he enjoys watching the landscape. He enjoys the beautiful landscape. And then he is reminded of his duties and responsibilities. He remembers he has a lot of unfulfilled promises to keep. And so he decides to go ahead with the journey. But when you go deeper, you would find the metaphorical meaning, the underlying meaning. What is that meaning? So the woods here is a symbol. It symbolizes the distractions in life, the temptations we have in life. So the poem conveys the idea that instead of falling prey to these temptations, we have to go ahead and accomplish our goals in life. We all have a lot to achieve in life. We have duties and responsibilities. And this is why Nehru found these lines so inspiring. So you have come to know how Robert Frost wrote his poems. His poems are very simple, conveying very simple ideas, but at the same time, they convey highly philosophical ideas. So, dear children, now let us go back to the poem at hand, Mending by Robert Frost. But before we read that poem, I would like you to watch a short biographical sketch of the poet Robert Frost. Once you watch that, we'll be coming back and read this poem, Mending.
Robert Frost was an American poet, one of the most popular of the 20th century. He won 4 Pulitzer Prizes and was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor in recognition of his poetry, which enabled the culture of the United States and the philosophy of the world. Frost was born in California in 1874, lived in England for a short while, but spent most of his life in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. It was his beloved New England that inspired hundreds of his poems. He drifted through several occupations before settling down to write. His first 2 collections, A Boy's Will and North of Boston, were published while he was living in England. By the time he returned to New Hampshire in 1950, his reputation was established, and by the 1920s he was the most celebrated poet in America. Although Frost attended Harvard for a short time, he never graduated. By the time he died in 1963, however, he had been awarded over 40 honorary degrees, including one from Harvard. Like all poets, his work has both admirers and detractors. His popularity is enduring, and he is still considered one of the greatest American poets.
Dear children, hope you have got a clear idea about the poet Robert Frost. Now let us move on to this poem, Mending. So see the title of this poem, Mending. What do you guess from this title? Do you think it's only about mending a wall, repairing a wall? Wall here is a boundary wall. The wall around your property. Now, do you think the poem tells about repairing a wall, or is it something beyond that? And do you think wall also is a symbol, as we have seen in the other 2 poems? And if so, what do you think can wall symbolize? What does the wall symbolize here? Dear children, we always talk about a world without walls. A world without walls. In Malayalam we say, Madilkettugal illatha logam. Madilugal illatha logam. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by a world without walls? Do we mean that a world where there are no boundary walls? No. Then what do we mean there? We mean a world without barriers, without man-made barriers. What are those man-made barriers? The invisible barriers that man has created. Many barriers are there. What are they? Mainly barriers of caste, barriers of religion, linguistic barriers, barriers of economic status, barriers of caste, creed, color. These are all the barriers that man has made for himself. For example, you feel the presence of an invisible wall between you and your friend just because you belong to different religions or castes. Actually, God hasn't created such a barrier. But we feel the presence of that invisible wall. And you could feel the presence of an invisible wall between you and a Tamilian. because you speak different languages. That's a linguistic barrier. And these are all the barriers that man has created for himself. Now, what do you think about these barriers? Do we need such barriers to live a harmonious, peaceful life? Or should we do away with all these barriers? Do we need such barriers? And I think this is the question this poem raises. Do we need these man-made barriers? And do barriers help us live a peaceful, harmonious life? And let us now read the poem Mending Wall and find out what the poet thinks about barriers, whether he thinks barriers are necessary or not. So first, you would listen to a beautiful rendition of this poem, and you could also read the lines on the screen. Please make sure that you read each and every line on the screen. And once you watch that, once you read the whole poem, we'll be coming back for a detailed discussion.
Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they've left not one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves, and some so nearly balls we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is we do not need the wall, he is all pine, and I'm apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone, grasped firmly by the top in each hand like an old stone savage, armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me. Not of woods only, in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying. And he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors.
I'm sure you enjoyed that poem. Was there any difficulty in understanding those lines? I don't think there was, because each line is so beautifully illustrated in that short film. Now let us go back to the question I asked you in the beginning. What does the poet think about walls? Does he think walls are necessary to ensure a peaceful living? After reading the whole poem, what do you understand? Does the poet think that walls are necessary? Actually, the poet thinks walls are unnecessary and unnatural. And he says there is no need of a wall between their farms, his farm and his neighbor's farm, because they have different crops. And in fact, the whole poem presents this conflict between the poet and his neighbor. But they are not just two individuals. They represent two different approaches, two different outlooks towards walls. The neighbor represents the traditional outlook that walls are necessary, and he keeps on repeating the old proverb, good fences make good neighbors. Whereas the poet represents the modern outlook, the liberal outlook, that walls are unnecessary, all kinds of barriers are unnecessary. They only hinder cooperation. They only prevent better neighborly relationships. So this poem presents this conflict between the traditional and the modern outlook. But at the same time, the poet doesn't say walls are altogether bad. And it is he who takes the initiative. He goes to the neighbor and informs that there are some gaps in the wall. And he also joins his neighbor in mending the wall. It shows that even within him there is this inner conflict. Even within his mind there is this inner conflict. The conflict between the traditionalist and the liberal. That is why he goes to the neighbor and informs him about the gaps in the wall. So in a way, the poem presents these two conflicts. The conflict between the two neighbors, the poet and his neighbor, between the traditional outlook and the modern outlook, and the other conflict, the inner conflict within the poet's mind. So, dear children, now we are going to read the whole poem again in parts so that I can explain to you each and every line. For your convenience, I have divided the poem into different parts. First, now you are going to read the first part of the poem. I would like you to have your textbook with you so that when I ask you questions, you could be ready with your answers. So please read the first part of the poem. Right? I'll be coming back with some questions and have a detailed discussion on each stanza there in that poem.
Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left not one stone on stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there.
Dear children, now you have read the first part of the poem. Let me ask you a few questions on those first few lines. So at the beginning itself, the poet says that there is some invisible force in nature that doesn't love a wall. He says there is something. He creates that tone of mystery. He presents a mysterious tone there. He says there is something in nature that doesn't love a wall. And how does this something damage the world? That means, how does nature damage the world? The something is something in nature, some invisible force in nature. How does nature damage the world? That is my question, the first question here. How does nature damage the world? Nature damages the world by sending a frozen groundswell. That is what the poet says, by sending a frozen groundswell. And the boulders fall apart and get scattered all over, and there appear gaps through which even two people can pass side by side. So how does the nature damage the walls? By sending a frozen groundswell. Frozen groundswell means during winter there is heavy snowfall in Europe, and as the ground gets damp, it swells, the ground swells, and the boulders fall apart, they get scattered. So this is how nature expresses her resentment, her rebellion against man-made walls. Nature doesn't love walls, and so nature sends its agent, the snow, to dampen the earth and to damage the wall. And there appears gaps through which even two people can pass abreast. Abreast means side by side. Two people can pass abreast, two people can pass side by side. Such wide gaps appear on the wall. Okay, now pass on to the next question. Why do hunters damage the wall? Then second question here. Why do hunters damage the wall? So it's not nature alone that damages walls. Hunters also damage the wall. The poet says the work of hunters is another thing. What was that first thing? The first was nature. And the work of hunters is another thing. And how do hunters damage the wall? Or why do hunters damage the wall? Hunters damage the wall to get the rabbits out of hiding. Okay, rabbits often hide behind these boulders. And to get them come out of the hiding place, hunters remove these boulders and thereby damage the walls. Hunters get the rabbits out of their hiding to please their hunting dogs. And in doing so, they damage the walls. So in two ways, these walls are damaged. One is the work of nature. Some invisible force in nature damages the wall. And every winter, this wall gets damaged. Secondly, it is the work of hunters. Hunters damage walls to get the rabbits out of hiding, to please their yelping dogs. And third question is, what is the tone created in these lines? What is the tone of these lines? What is the tone of these lines? These lines create a tone of mystery, a mysterious tone. The first line itself creates such a tone. The poet says there is something that doesn't love a wall. And the last two lines of this part, you see, again creates that tone of mystery. He says, nobody knows when these gaps are made and how these gaps are made. But during spring mending time, we find them there. So these lines again create that tone of mystery. So dear children, we have had a very long session now. Now we'll wind it up now, and then we'll take up the rest of the poem in another session. So goodbye.